Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Welcome to the podcast of the Marion E. Wade Center, and we thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking in the next few weeks on our podcast about the Ken and Jean Hansen lectures. Crystal, you want to explain a bit about what that lectureship series involves?
Yeah, in 2015, the son of Ken and Jean Hansen, Walter Hansen, and his wife, Darlene, conceptualized a series of lectures that could engage conversation between the Wade Center and faculty on Wheaton's campus, encouraging them to do research among our various 7 authors, and then present a series of 3 lectures that were collected along with responses from various Wheaton professors, and then published by IVP Academic.
This is a wonderful idea because it allows a lot of different faculty to engage in interdisciplinary work. It also involves networking of people that you would never expect to be conversing about an academic topic, and it gets us further into our 7 authors from a new perspective.
It also brings together various faculty members from different departments. So in our initial series, Dr. Riken spoke about his knowledge of Tolkien, but then he had a respondent from the history of Christianity, and he had a respondent from the neural sciences to talk about the power of fantasy. So it creates a wonderful interdisciplinary conversation, and that's something that we try to take advantage of when we interview these various Hansen lecturers.
On a personal note, one of the things I've enjoyed the most about the Hansen lectures is getting to know Walter and Darlene Hansen. They're really wonderful thinkers and spiritual seekers, and they're very interested in supporting the arts and the intellectual activities of the Wade Center. So that friendship has really been an important part of the process for Crystal and I.
Right. And Walter has written introductions to the various book projects, which are beautiful pronouncements of his goal behind the Hansen lectureships, but also about the significance of our 7 authors.
Crystal, we've had 4 Hansen lecturers now. Can you tell us about the first one that we're going to feature on a podcast?
We had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Timothy Larson, who is a specialist in 19th century British history, so that he was a perfect researcher to talk to us about George MacDonald.
He's written a fascinating book called The Crisis of Doubt, about how some Victorians were losing their faith in the 19th century, but other Victorians were regaining their faith. And I already knew about this book before I came to Wheaton. Another real advantage of coming to the Wade Center is meeting so many people whose books I admire, and I really am getting to admire just as colleagues here on campus.
Yes, I think all of you are going to enjoy our conversation with Tim Larson. Hello, this is Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my fellow co-director at the Marion E. Wade Center, Dr. David C. Downing. And we have with us the author of a fantastic book called George MacDonald in the Age of Miracles. Dr. Timothy Larson is very well published in 19th century British literature and history. He presented 3 lectures for the Ken and Jean Hansen lecture series here at the Wade. And this book is the result of that. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us.
I'm very glad to be here.
So I want to start, Tim, by asking you a question that concerns me because I have taught Victorian literature for decades. And when I encountered MacDonald, I was shocked that he had so much influence in Victorian England, because in the literature anthologies that are taught in most universities and colleges across America, the Norton Anthology, the Longman Anthology, MacDonald's name does not appear once. in any of those anthologies. In the 1,000-page Macmillan edition of Victorian prose, MacDonald's name is not mentioned once. And there's even a more recent book called Victorian Religion by Julie Melnick, published 2008. MacDonald is not mentioned once. Why do you think that is?
I didn't actually know some of those facts, so that's fascinating, first of all, and I think it is unfair. MacDonald actually made his living as a creative author, which I wonder how many people in Victorian Britain that's true of. I think that's putting him in quite a rarefied group, that he was successful enough to earn his income full-time by being a creative author. I think maybe because he worked in so many different genres that he wasn't the go-to person for this one thing that makes him fall between multiple stools. I think that might be part of it. But I don't want to be too paranoid, but I do think, particularly for his realist fiction, the fact that the Christianity is so overt, a lot of scholars have been allergic to that. They tend to think of confessional themes as bad literature, when that's, of course, just confusing two different categories altogether. You can do a confessional theme poorly or well. Evelyn Waugh, for example, in Brideshead Revisited, does a confessional theme that very well, and I think that MacDonald does sometimes as well. So those are my initial thoughts on why that is.
I thought about that too. In your book In the Age of Doubt, you mentioned that Cardinal Newman was not mentioned among major figures, so it may be part of the same syndrome.
Yes, that I was talking about an encyclopedia of 19th century thought, and it had all of these very obscure minor figures who had done kind of slightly wacky pseudoscience kind of mystical things, or very minor kind of materialist or secularist thinkers. And then John Henry Newman was not in there. Thomas Chalmers was not in there. Very, very influential figures intellectually in the 19th century and beyond. But I think because they worked on theology, the editor couldn't see them as intellectual.
Right. As I was looking at MacDonald's works, some of his realistic novels, they reminded me of Thomas Hardy. But once again, Hardy always has sort of a negative worldview and the sense of depression and ultimate meaninglessness underlying. And with MacDonald, it's not long before you get a spiritual uplift. So once again, I'm wondering if that's part of the problem with MacDonald. How would you rate him as a literary figure, as a novelist, apart from his Christian worldview?
Yeah, so I think it's important to not just cheerlead, but to kind of answer those questions, with kind of a real comparative objectivity. To me, Jane Austen is comparable as a 19th century British author. I think she's just superb. So there's a kind of handful that are up there higher. But if we had to save out of the last library in the world just Thomas Hardy or George MacDonald, I would be taking the George MacDonald shelves with me out the door and let Hardy burn for sure. So you've made the right comparison there. And I think, again, I want to go back to the genre thing. I think that his princess stories and those kind of fairy tales are superb. And he's as good as anyone. And he's not only as good as anyone, he's pioneering. So he's not just copying, he's actually pushing forward, particularly the genre of fantasy, in a really kind of first generation way that other people recognized who knew what he was doing. He was close friends with Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, and they're together kind of creating literature for children. They're creating fantasy literature. They're creating new forms of literature. And I think MacDonald rates very highly for that.
I'm not sure how much you delved into the literary side. I know you were interested in the theological implications of his works in your lectures and in the book. But I was struck by the fact that he was sponsored by Lady Byron. He was a friend of Tennyson. He was a friend of Mark Twain. Yes. Lewis Carroll read Alice in Wonderland to MacDonald's children. That's a pretty...
he was a friend of Ruskin.
Ruskin is there. That's quite a literary pantheon for him to be associated with in his day. But I wonder if there has been some change in sensibility since MacDonald was so popular.
And those people often had very different views theologically or in other ways. And they respected him as an author. They respected his work, not just him as kind of a nice fellow that they knew, but as an author. Mark Twain really liked MacDonald's work. And Twain is, probably one of the most famous skeptical thinkers of 19th century America. His children, they read their copies of MacDonald till they fell apart. Mark Twain talked about co-writing a novel with MacDonald, and that only didn't happen because of practical logistics, but not because they didn't respect each other so much that they loved the idea of doing that. So I think there is a real difference, and so much gets lost over time. And I think it's important to remember that in his day, he was highly respected by the readers that he was writing to.
If you asked me to guess which American literary figure was attracted to MacDonald and read his works carefully, Mark Twain wouldn't be in my top 50 guesses.
Exactly. It's extraordinary.
I'd be down to people who had already died when George MacDonald published his books before I got to Mark Twain. They both had a love of little girls, little children, and a real sense of the kind of this angelic sensibility. Did you get into the kind of Victorian fascination with childhood? I've been told that was a new phenomenon among the Victorians, child labor laws and this idealization of especially little girls.
Yeah, it definitely was new. I think some of them, and MacDonald in particular, were reacting against what they saw as a very stern manifestation of Calvinism in their childhood, which kind of thought that what you want to do is kind of beat the will out of a child. You want to kind of break their will because they are pre-programmed to be evil, and the way that you respond to that is by kind of crushing what they love, anything they have pride in themselves, and you must kind of humiliate, and that's how you make them into an adult, mature Christian.
And you have a problem with that fallacy?
I don't, but my children do. So MacDonald reacted by emphasizing the goodness of creation and the goodness of the things that God has given us. That, music, for example, is part of the gift of this life that God has given to us, where his grandmother burnt the violin because she was afraid it was becoming an idol, and so that contrast. And so then you have the two things going on. One, celebrating childhood as about the goodness of creation, about God making human beings for them to find fullness in life. And so he's looking at children to express that, but he's also trying to correct a kind of sinister or strict approach to children that had happened earlier, and he wants to deliberately go in the other direction in order to compensate for that.
That's right. At the beginning of the 19th century, 6-year-old children would often work in mines for 10-hour days. And the child labor laws changed, so they only had to work 8-hour days. And so during the winter, some children would not see the sun for months on end. So this transition, I think also part of it can be aligned with the Romantic poets. And I know Wordsworth was an important influence on MacDonald, as he was on all the Victorians. Coleridge's Frost at Midnight is said to be the first poem ever written where a father expresses affection for a baby. Wow. And then, of course, Wordsworth's idealization of children. But I wonder how much, too, there was a crisis of faith in the Victorian era, although what you have done is shown that has been exaggerated. And I love your book, The Crisis of Doubt, to explore individuals who gave up on their faith and then returned to Christianity. But I wonder how much even this idealization of children is this desire to go back to a time of innocence, a time before all these questions were being developed about Christianity, before Darwin's Origin of Species sold out immediately, before, as Tennyson said, we had a sense of nature red in tooth and claw. So here, children aren't having to grapple with these things. And the very fact that Alice in Wonderland goes through a hole is just like she's going down into the geology vortex that was traumatizing so many people.
Yes.
So then it makes sense that MacDonald writing stories about children would be attractive.
But the Princess of Goblins, sorry to interrupt you, but Curate spends a lot of time in the mines, and he spends extra time by himself to earn extra money. And MacDonald never comments that, isn't that sad that this little kid has to live this way? It seems a normal part of the story.
At the back of the North Wind, he's a working child. He's
Right.
essentially like an Uber driver of the 19th century.
Right.
So both those things, I liked the way you set that up, Crystal, because, Paul Ricoeur talks about having a second naivete, that we need to get back beyond all of this corroding skepticism and disillusionment that has come on us in the modern period and find something that is part of the purity of childhood. And of course, that ties deeply into New Testament themes of having a childlike faith, of being born again. And I think that is right, that a lot of Victorians knew that they had something precious in their faith as a child. And then they went through periods of being confused by all kinds of theories and doubts and reading all kinds of skeptical literature. And there was a yearning of, even if some of those theories are true or some of those ideas are right, there was something about that childlike faith that was also true. And how can I find my way back to that? And MacDonald does want us as adults to be better adults because we remember what it's like to be a child.
Yeah, I think of Arnold's famous lines in Dover Beach. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar. And he encapsulated what a lot of people were feeling. So his implication is that the sea of faith was once encouraging us, giving us hope, but that hope is being lost. So, to be back in those days.
Yeah, and what I tried to do in Crisis of Doubt that I want to emphasize here, it's also in the book, is the Victorian age was deeply an age of faith. And people worried about doubt and talked about doubt incessantly precisely because they valued faith so much. You focus on the things that can hurt or destroy the things that you value the most. So Victorians valued faith. And so doubt was a perennial concern, not because there wasn't any faith, but because they were protecting it, because they knew it was important. So I think we confuse doubt with just skepticism or unbelief or secularization. And that's not what's going on. What's going on is people who understand that faith is precious and therefore are vigilant to see how it might erode.
Well, the skeptics you mentioned in your book, The Crisis of Doubt, the very fact that they're struggling with Christianity and trying to debunk religion, that shows a kind of wrestling with spiritual issues, which I think you're in a better place spiritually when you're wrestling from a negative point of view than someone who just doesn't care. I was struck how many of them, even in their skeptical phase, there was a kind of religious earnestness, very Victorian earnestness, even to their skepticism.
Absolutely. That's something I learned by reading the research for that book and writing that book, that, there's an old saying that there's a thin line between love and hate. And when people want to tell you every day why they hate God, there's a love affair going on there that's a bit tempestuous. So the book was about a lot of atheist leaders who came back to faith, and there was a kind of protesting too much in their atheist phase. They could not let it go. They wanted to talk about God all day long, even though he didn't exist. And I think you're right that showed a kind of emotional engagement, which, like we see in all the kind of classic romantic comedies, might end. It looks like they hate each other, but they're actually way too interested in hating each other.
Yeah.
Justin had this great quote: "If you can't get close enough to Christianity to love it, you should get far enough away not to hate it." That was an interesting.
Yes,
but they're somewhere in that borderline between love and hate, I think.
Yeah. Or like Tennyson's line, "There is more faith and honest doubt than in half of the creeds." When did you start reading MacDonald?
I came to MacDonald pretty late. So this has been fun for me, even though he's a great Wheaton author. And he's right in my period. In some ways, I think because he was right in my period, it was so obvious I didn't go towards it. So really, MacDonald was totally me as a listener of audiobooks, which I do incessantly. And so I would get them just for sheer pleasure with no research plans at all. And I listened to the princess stories, Princess and Curdy and Princess and the Goblin and Lilith and Fantastes and a few others like that. But I was doing it just like I do any other audiobook. It could have been a 20th century murder mystery or whatever it was. But the fantasy books in particular, they're so strange that there's a kind of compellingness. It's not what you expect. MacDonald would get letters all the time. People tried to read them like they were reading Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And they're like, I know it's an allegory, but I can't decode it. Can you send me the key?
Yeah.
And he's like, it's not that kind of book.
Right.
It's not like it's devoid of meaning, but it's not giving you meaning in that kind of one-to-one correspondence sort of way.
But they are very dreamlike. They're very episodic, and they're full of symbolic suggestiveness, but it's hard to say what exactly he's aiming at in a particular image.
I had the same experience with another Wade author when I read The Man Who Is Thursday, G.K. Chesterson's book, which is also a wonderfully strange book, that you just have to set the terms that the author is setting for this whole other world and ride and experience that you're on that is not mapping onto any genre you've read before directly.
That's true of Charles Williams as well. You just go along for the ride saying, what are you doing, Charles? But I'll stay on.
Slightly different topic. Why did you call this book In the Age of Miracles, George MacDonald? Where did that title come from?
Yeah, I was being a little bit of a provocateur or tweaking people a bit. So many scholars so wrongly think of the 19th century in Britain as a secularized time. There's all these textbooks where religion just goes away by about the 1820s, and they completely ignore it like, it's been, some German wrote some book, and after that point, nobody believes in God anymore or something. There was actually a recent book out of Yale University Press called The Age of Doubt about 19th century Britain. So my own view as a historian is that it's an age that is filled with faith, that faith is predominant and looms so large in what people read, what they hear, what they talk about, how they live their lives, how they structure their time. So I wanted to think of the 19th century as an age of miracles, the exact opposite of all these people who think of it as an age of secularization.
Okay. I think you succeeded very well.
The subtitle of the book is what? Incarnation, Doubt, and Reenchantment. That's what they called it. And I think of those as three miracles: the miracle of the incarnation, the miracle of faith, and the miracle of sanctification. So I also was using the Age of Miracles to take those two and think of them as miracles.
Okay. Now, do you have anything like spoiler alerts that you don't want us to talk about in the book?
No, you go for whatever you want.
Well, I wanted you to amplify a bit on the Age of Atonement evolving into the Age of Incarnation as an important 19th century phenomena, which has affected writers like George MacDonald.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a well-recognized phenomenon that happened, that the incarnation became the central leading doctrine in the second half of the 19th century and a bit beyond, pretty much all the way up to World War I. And in the first half, the atonement, Christ's death on the cross in particular, was the dominant doctrine, and people saw the whole Christian faith through that doctrine. Boyd Hilton is a wonderful scholar who teased out that theme in all kinds of fascinating ways in politics and economics. And what he's emphasizing in atonement is not just the doctrine, but a focus on God's judgment, on God's wrath, on the necessity of sin being punished. Those are all the doctrines that are kind of there together, and that then reflects how people view life in so many ways. The incarnation was much more about the goodness of creation, the affirmation of life, about God's fatherhood, about God's goodness, about God's love. And MacDonald lives through that transition and actually is an agent of that transition. He grows up in a very Age of Atonement kind of model of Christianity. And in some of his books, he's quoting his grandmother and he's quoting other figures in his life pretty much verbatim with their kind of rants that are kind of, in his way of seeing it, kind of squashing down the goodness of life in their effort to squash down sin. They're actually squashing down God's creation as well and the things that God wants us to affirm. And so his move towards emphasis on childhood, his move towards an emphasis on Christmas, his move towards an emphasis on the holy love of God are all his efforts to go beyond the age of atonement to the age of incarnation.
Mm-hmm. My home church growing up in Colorado didn't get that memo.
Yes.
They're still fascinated by atonement, not quite sure what to make of Christmas and the incarnation.
Yes, I remember in my childhood hearing Christmas sermons that were on the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. So that's people who all atonement all the time. That's like 24/7, this is our message.
One of the things I didn't know until I read your book was that it was quite common to tell ghost stories during Christmas. So when Dickens writes A Christmas Carol and has the visitation of these three ghosts, he was just operating according to a certain convention of the time.
Absolutely. That was one of the things that surprised me as well, doing the research for this book, to think we have that song that we still sing, There'll Be Crazy Ghost Stories and Tales of the Glories of Christmases Long, Long Ago. So we have a little bit of a memory that ghost stories are part of Christmas, but they're not part of our Christmas. But the Victorians love them. And it does tie into the theme of childhood because, ghost stories are particularly exciting for children. But it's also, the winter time, the darkness, around the fire, the cold outside. And it's a domestic kind of thing that we're all together as a family, sharing together some exciting tale that someone's reading aloud to the rest of the family. So we don't think anymore of A Christmas Carol as a ghost story, but that's exactly how Dickens thought of it. And he wrote ghost stories for lots of Christmas seasons, including one called The Haunted House. So he was all in with the ghost story genre.
I really liked in your book how you would pick up on phrases that themselves were loaded with historical significance. Like one of the great phrases is how MacDonald was the first red letter Christian.
Yes. Yeah, that was good.
Do you want to explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, Red Letter Christians, if you don't know, is a contemporary movement that emphasizes the center of Christianity being the very words of Christ in the gospel. So they try to build their whole view of the Christian life by giving priority to the things that Jesus said. And that is exactly what MacDonald does. It's his way of getting you back on course. So he doesn't think that the words that Jesus said are all that matters. He's not throwing out the rest of the Bible, but he thinks that people, by taking something in the Old Testament, for example, and making it central, have a skewed view of Christian discipleship. And so he thinks if you just focus on what Jesus himself said, that will major on the major things. And then in time, you will find out how these other things fall in place once you've got the center in the center. And I think that, that sounds like it can be kind of too reductionistic, but MacDonald is aware that the sayings of Jesus are not always easy. So it's not just the simplest, most accessible things. He's aware that sometimes Jesus says things that are hard and cryptic, but he says, listen to the master. That's what it means to be a disciple, is to have a master. And your master is Jesus Christ. And your task is, first of all, to hear his voice and to obey what he's saying to you. And if you've got that right, then you can see the rest of Christian thought and life and scriptures through the right lens.
You pick up on the phrase, the one thing needful, which was an important phrase in the Victorian era. Of course, it comes from the Mary Martha story, but Carlyle uses it to talk about the one thing needful is work. And a lot of people emphasize the gospel of work that Carlyle initiated. And then, of course, Dickens uses it in Hard Times. The one thing needful is imagination. What is wonderful about MacDonald is that he's arguing the one thing needful, as you just said, is trust in Jesus Christ. And so because of that, he does not obsess about who is in the faith and who is outside of the faith. He's just celebrating the one thing needful. And some people have assumed that he has fallen into universalism. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I do not think it's the right category to put MacDonald in, to call him a universalist. I think that is too sweeping and simplistic. He does not have an entirely traditional doctrine of the afterlife, and so that is true. But it's not what people imagine with the universe. So he's not a universalist in the sense he's never saying what's going to happen to people in the future. He's never making a promise, this is the truth, everybody's going to be saved. He does hold out hope that people can be freed from their sin even after they die. But people can also hold on to their sin after they die. And so he, in some ways, it's a more robust view of God's continual warfare with sin. Even if you're in hell, God is still not satisfied with the fact that you're a sinner and is still challenging you to lay down and free yourself from your sin.
Well, other traditions have more interest in that question. The whole idea of the harrowing of hell, that when Christ went and preached to the spirits in prison, that he was giving them a second chance and redeeming some of the captives. It's interesting, the Roman Catholic Church has a much more developed sense of possibilities after life than most Protestant denominations do.
Yeah, and it's a pastoral issue. People naturally wonder. And what interests me about the Christian tradition and the scriptures is it never identifies particular individuals in hell. Hell is always put out as a warning, and you are to have a fear of God that comes on you about how you live your life. And MacDonald believed that strongly. He was a prophet of holiness. So his rethinking of the afterlife is not because he doesn't take sin seriously. He takes sin utterly seriously, and he is absolutely focused on the holiness of a holy God and his insistence that you must let go of your sin at whatever cost. It doesn't matter how painful it is. He is going to demand it from you.
It never occurred to me the Bible doesn't mention specifics, because Dante certainly does.
Yes, he does.
That guy who kept taking my parking space, he's obviously in Circle 3 of the Inferno. Lewis thought that part of MacDonald's value was being a myth maker. He said most myths evolve over time, and you can't really create them an allegory for what does Homer mean. But he thought there were modern myth makers. He actually considers Kafka to be a kind of myth maker, but he also gives MacDonald that high tribute. Did you run into passages that you said there's a kind of a mythic quality to this image or this passage apart from the narrative? Let me give you an example for me. When I was reading about the rose fire and this beautiful old woman who says, "Put your hands into the rose fire," and when Curate pulls his hands out, he's in terrible pain, but she's got tears in her eyes. And she says, "I've also put my hands into the rose fire." And then this deformed creature comes out. But when he touches that creature, he feels the hand of a beautiful young child. And it's not exactly allegorical, but it strikes me as a very mythic moment in that story. Did you run into other episodes like that?
Well, yes, I did, but I won't be able to come up with them off the top of my head. But I want to talk about the one that you just mentioned, because you may not know because you weren't here yet, but the lectures were actually called The Rose Fire when I gave them as lectures.
Oh, is that right?
At the Wade Center. And I've been deeply shaped by that image. I actually use it in my prayer life now sometimes. I think it is a wonderfully evocative, because the rose fire not only purifies as a sanctifying fire, but it also bestows spiritual gifts. It's a kind of reminder of the work of the Holy Spirit. And I found it an extremely effective theme that runs throughout those stories.
Part of the reason that we even archive George MacDonald here at the Wade Center is because of the power he had on the imagination of C.S. Lewis, because, of course, these collections began with correspondence between Clyde Kilby and C.S. Lewis. And the famous line from Lewis, of course, is that he had discovered Phantastes and it baptized his imagination. Have you thought about that statement and how the baptism you think works? Because that was long before Lewis became a Christian.
You know, I was just reading this afternoon C.S. Lewis's introduction to Athanasius's On the Incarnation. And I'm not going to get an exact quote, but he has in there a kind of section where he's talking about how non-Christians can get a whiff of the smell of Christianity in an author, even when there isn't an explicitly theological theme. They just notice the odor, and depending on who they are, they're upset or they're intrigued. But it's there against the most diverse authors, is the point that C.S. Lewis is making. Authors from different centuries, from different denominations. There is the odor of Christianity. Well, maybe we would even say the odor of Christ. And I think that's what happened with him, is that he thinks he's safe because he's reading a fairy tale or a fantasy story, and yet the odor of Christ is there, and it's all the more intriguing because you can't pin it down and say, oh, here's where now we went into a speech about the cross or something that proves that this is all very Christian. But the baptism is... I'm Baptistic, so for me it's always by immersion. It's the whole thing, and you're into something totally different, and you're coming out different. And even in a secular sense, all good authors do that. They take you in to their own world completely. And in MacDonald's case, his world was always fragranced by Christ, and I think Lewis could smell that even as a non-Christian and didn't know what to do with it.
Paul has that phrase where the aroma of Christ to those that are perishing.
Yeah.
I tried to float the motto for the Wade Center, where the aroma of Christ to those that are publishing, but that didn't catch on. He's an interesting example because sometimes he does get didactic and theological. MacDonald does, and he actually has a theological conversation, but it's not that effective because it's so transparent to the reader that he's embedding latent sermons in the text. But when he uses his imagination, as in the fantasy stories, I think the aroma of the Christian worldview and of Christ comes through better in his imaginary stories than in his more realistic discussions in some of his other novels.
I agree with that completely, but it also is a difference between our age and the Victorian age. The Victorians read sermons avidly. It was a major genre for the Victorians. T.H. Huxley, who coined the word agnostic to describe his own lack of belief in God, when he wanted to put together some essays that he'd written on geology and other things, he titled them lay sermons because he thought that was a really exciting title that would bring in lots of readers. Can you imagine a world today where publishers say, can we put the word sermon in the title to make sure people buy it? So, yeah, I think what you're saying is undoubtedly true, but it wasn't as true then. But he will, literally put sermons in his novels. You'll have the chapter will end with and the minister began to preach, and the next chapter will be the sermon. It's like
that's funny because in Moby Dick there's a famous sermon right in the early. I hadn't thought of written sermons as being an important genre.
And what you're identifying is how MacDonald reflects the sensibilities of the Victorians so much more than most of the Victorians who are anthologized in surveys of 19th century British literature. And it's almost because the people who anthologized them wanted to focus on the crisis of faith and move away from Christianity, rather than to really capture what the majority of Victorians were enchanted by.
Absolutely. So the best-selling novel in United States history was Uncle Tom's Cabin, which has whole passages in it which discuss the correct interpretation of Scripture. It's very didactic and very Christian. It gets finally surpassed by Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which becomes the best-selling novel in American history. In the 1880s in Britain, the best-selling novel is one that most people probably haven't heard of, Robert Ellesmere. Some people I have read claim it's the best-selling novel of the 19th century in Britain, a book that is not ever assigned to students anymore. And part of the reason is because the drama is the drama of faith. It's about whether people will give in to temptation, whether they will still believe, how they will construct their faith in light of the doubts and challenges that are coming to them. That was a gripping conversation to have in the 19th century. And arguably, we're an impoverished society because we can't see the drama of faith anymore.
Well, I read a lot of Hawthorne. My PhD is in American literature, and I'd read virtually all his works with the understanding that he was post-Christian, that his criticism of the Puritans reflected his own post-Christian views. And I picked up his letters after I had my PhD, and it was quite clear to me that he was a believing Christian. And I was amazed I could get all the way through graduate school and not get that message on Hawthorne. I wonder if that's a widespread phenomenon in historiography, that they're sort of writing Christianity out of history.
Yes, thank you. I am continually hitting up against this. Secular scholars, they have in their mind a very false and unrealistic caricature of the perfectly strict Orthodox Christian. And then they imagine any deviation from that means that you're on the road to secularism, so you're as good as secular for our purposes. And they lump everybody they like into that category. And even their reading of what counts shows a complete misunderstanding of the tradition. So you'll read, this person clearly wasn't a good Christian because they wrote in their diary, "How long, O Lord?" Not realizing, of course, that that's just a scripture quotation.
Right.
But for them, it's like this kind of rage against the deity that we see breaking out that shows that they were on their way to kind of being totally free from this confinement of orthodoxy when they're actually just practicing their faith by quoting scripture and praying within the tradition. And I find that over and over again, figures are labeled as free-thinking or secular or skeptical or some such phrase. And if you actually read into their lives, they are praying and engaging with devotional literature and scripture in very sustained ways.
Lewis has a funny satirical point on the medieval ages of being dark and ignorant and no learning, and suddenly there's the Renaissance, and he didn't even like the word Renaissance. He said if there was a Renaissance, it didn't happen in England. But at one point, he says, he quotes one of these historiographers on the Middle Ages, and he says there was savage and ignorant times, and there was cruelty to children, and then Galileo said the sun is the center of the solar system, not the earth. And he imagines people saying, well, if the sun's the center of the solar system, I'm going to treat my children better. So he had actually the same fight that you're having, but with the Middle Ages versus the Renaissance.
And how much of that could explain why he was not promoted at Oxford?
Well, there were several reasons, but that's certainly one of them. He foregrounded his Christianity in his books, not in his teaching, but he was a popularizer and he was an evangelizer, and those two were
those were anathema by modernists who were responding to the Victorians. I want to go back to MacDonald. Of his various novels written for adults, which do you like the best, and why?
I'd like to be more specific. He wrote 90 books. Could you rate them for us? Yes, from 1 to 90? Would that be all right?
I tried to avoid the ones that had lots of dialect in them.
Oh, yeah.
I don't have the patience for reading through it, at least in that time period that I was allotted. I thought I'm going to spend half of my time just figuring out what this character is saying. So Thomas Wingfield, the Curate, is probably the one that I would pick. Because again, like Robert Ellesmere, it is about the drama of faith. And there's a wonderfully powerful scene in it where this minister is trying to lead this woman to give up her revengeful spirit and her bitterness and all of these destructive things that we know Christ told us not to have. And he comes to the point where he realizes that the revenge that she wants to do would actually remove a dangerous figure out of the life of the person that he most loves. So he, as a worldly person, really wants her to follow through on her scheme because then it would solve a great anxiety in his own life about somebody he loves dearly. And now now the temptation's on him. I've been preaching to you. I've been the pastor, and I know what Christ wants. He wants you to give up your revenge. And now he's got to preach to himself and say, well, I follow Christ even at the cost of risking what I love most. And it is wonderfully done as literature. I think it's a great dramatic build-up and setup, but it is the drama of holiness. It is the drama of following Christ that is at the center of that scene, and both things are happening at the same time.
In your book on MacDonald, you have 3 respondents. Was there anything that your respondents said when they gave their lectures that gave you a new perspective on your own research on MacDonald?
Yes, Jill Baumgartner really changed my mind in some ways. One of the things that we haven't talked about, but that is often the most talked about with this book so far, is that I argue that MacDonald was a bad pastor and that he sabotaged his own pastoral ministry because he really wanted to be a writer and not a pastor. Some of the people who most revere MacDonald have not found it easy to accept the way that I explain all of that and how ruthlessly, I guess, I try to expose that. What Jill did in her response really helped me think it through differently. And what she argued was that lots of people end up in circumstances in positions that they wouldn't choose for themselves as not their own fantasy idea of their calling. And yet God can use that. And so I've kind of changed my view to say that MacDonald shouldn't have been in the pastorate. And I've thought more about MacDonald could have served in love in the pastorate. And he just wasn't handling a circumstance that he didn't want in the right way at that time in his life. And he actually could have been a good pastor if he would have been willing to take on a love for his congregation and serving them. Now, what I do in the end of the book is show that MacDonald really does experience sanctification over time. And so the young MacDonald has these flaws that we actually, I think, can demonstrably see in the evidence of his life and his letters. He has been made more holy over time, and those flaws are not there that we see in the early period. But that's a time in his life where he wasn't submitting to the will of God in a way that he became really committed to later on.
I think it's a quote from Wilfred Cumber Mead.
Yeah.
Is that from your book where he says of a character who didn't become a Christian, he said he was still growing, which is all that we can ask of any man. Maybe that's all that we can ask of MacDonald in his life, like all of us.
I think he thought that way about John Keats, to be honest. He thought that if he would have lived longer, and also Shelley, that there were, you could see seeds of potential that could have grown into something if they had lived longer. It's a very hopeful view.
That is a hopeful view.
And that is a good view to end our conversation on. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation.
I love the Wade Center. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Really enjoyed the conversation.